Chapter 3. School's out for Steve. By the time I headed into the senior ranks at Argyle House, I'd become easily distracted in class. If you want to be honest, I became the class clown, the class idiot, more than anything else. For example, I'd be throwing rubbers at kids' heads so I could make people laugh. Looking back, I was doing this not only for attention, but I think I was looking for some kind of acceptance. I'd say I came from a middle-class background, and it's only now that I realise how hard both my parents worked to put me into private school. Then my little brother was 4 and he was going into school too. It must have been a costly experience for them both. I can honestly say that if both my parents had never done what they'd done for me, there was a possibility that I could have ended up on a different path. I certainly wouldn't have been in the position I am now, that's for sure. We were usually in a class of around 30. Me and another lad called Jeff, who was a Sunderland lad from a wealthy family, would often start off the new term by sitting right at the back of the class. Within half an hour to an hour of the first school day, it was guaranteed the teacher would have moved me and Jeff to the front to keep an eye on us because we were both so disruptive. If it was ever raining on a playtime, then me and Jeff would be instigating stupid things like, let's empty the filing cabinet and see if we can pass the cabinets to the front of the class, then back again before the teacher checks in on his walk around. We'll be throwing compasses out the windows and waiting for unsuspecting victims' shrieks. If you would hear silly noises in the classroom, it was us. If someone drew a cock on a board so teachers would get embarrassed, that was us. Me and Jeff quickly learned which teachers were easy to wind up and which ones wouldn't tolerate our crap. At times, me or Jeff would bring our ghetto blasters in, which we'd smuggled in our old head bags. Just looked like our PE kit. But for whatever reason, we would record the lessons. Then when the teacher said something else, we would play what he or she just said a few minutes previously to make her think or him think that they were hearing things. It was all really immature stuff, but it made us laugh. And at the time we thought we were comedians, and the classroom was our stage. And we would play to our baying audience who thought we were side-splitting. Another one of our ideas was to take a Polaroid camera in to see if we could get sneaky photos of innocent suspecting folks when the lessons were going on. At times, the plan would be for Jeff to do something silly to get the teacher's attention, and then when he was getting the grilling, I'd be doing my David Bailey impressions. That kind of rubbish, I'm ashamed to say, carried on for the next 5 years, more or less, in Argyle House School. To be brutally honest, I just didn't have an interest in school, and Jeff was the same. I remember there being a maths teacher who will remain nameless. He's now a police officer, but he just didn't like me at all. He just couldn't stand me, not to mention he was a staunch Sunderland fan and he knew I was a mag. That didn't do me any favours at all with him. I know even to this day that he didn't like me because I supported Newcastle United, but also because he thought I was a bit cocky. He would say something to me, usually something negative, and I would just answer him back with attitude, and he didn't like it. I had a similar relationship with the English teacher. He just didn't like me either. That English teacher would often grab me by the ear. Of course, that was at a time where you could get away with doing that to your students in the classroom. He eventually left to have an operation, but never returned. Every cloud has a silver lining, they say. When I was in 3rd year, a new English teacher came in called Peter Yates. And Mr. Yates basically saw something in me that would change my life for the better. But I'll come back to that later in the book. At that time, I wasn't that interested in doing sports myself. Yes, I liked football, but I had 2 left feet when it came to playing it. I never liked doing any of the cross-country running that our PE sessions would provide. And my dad at the time thought I should follow him in sport. He liked golf and rugby, but they just weren't for me. I suppose my social dynamic changed when I got into drama. Now, I'd always been into acting since I was 7 at St Anne's, and I'd been picked to play the lead part of King Canute in our school play. For the most part, I was behind in my early years at school, but I'd always excelled in drama to the point where my parents started taking me to drama school. And I had elocution lessons at Argyle House to help me speak better. I then began taking part in poetry competitions, and I even won a few against other schools in the northeast. It would seem I had a natural flair for it, and I still had the certificates I gained in school to this day. Through my secondary school years, my parents enrolled me into the People's Theatre in Jesmond. At that time, there was a scheme running called the Young People's Theatre, which was set up by a gentleman named Nick Whitfield. It was an amateur theatre group for beginners, and I would go at 10 a.m. on a Saturday morning, and we'd start by doing warm-up games. Then we'd do improvisations, and we'd finish at 12. I went on to do that every single week from the age of 11 to 18, and that gave me the confidence I needed for my acting career. It was the same place that Neil Tennant from the Pet Shop Boys went to. Another guy called Tom Hill went on, but these days he's called Tom Goodman Hill. He's been in films with the likes of Sean Connery and was recently in ITV's hit 4-part drama Cheat. I'd say it was in that place that I really learned my craft for drama. Obviously, I was involved in plays. It would be more than just me on a Saturday morning, and I'd have to dedicate myself to rehearsals during the week. I played the Artful Dodger from Oliver Twist. I played Monks, who was David Copperfield's eldest brother in David Copperfield, among others. It got to a point where I was doing so well in the youth theatre and the adult theatre began to notice me, and they became interested in me for their roles. My first ever review in a newspaper came from playing the part of Lol, also known as Laurie Lee in the play Cider with Rosie. It was also my first stage kiss when I was only 13. Not only did I get a review, but that day it was the best review, so you can imagine how big that was for the 13-year-old Steve Wraith that my name had been in the paper. You know all about the class idiot Steve Wraith, but away from school I had this separate life, and I was rapidly becoming a bit of a local star. And I think that's why when I look back at all those years, I had this attitude of, oh well, school's not important anyway, because I'm well on my way to becoming a famous actor. As soon as I walked into that theatre at age 11, I knew that was what I wanted to do in my life, and it became tunnel vision. I think that's why I kept up with my elocution and poetry, because I saw that as an extra part of my future, which I may need. Drama was my sole focus. On the acting itself, learning the lines came with ease. The first part I got, aged 11 at the People's Theatre, was in A Midsummer Night's Dream by William Shakespeare. I would play Puck, which was one of the main parts, Chief Fairy. And again, I nailed it, which again led me to getting rave reviews. When I was in my early teens, I would get a massive opportunity because the youth theatre started doing trips abroad, which led me to audition for a part in Under Milk Wood, which was a very famous radio drama made in 1954 and has been made into a film. I went for this part and I got it, meaning I would be touring in America. With that, I did New York, Jersey and Philadelphia. It was in New Jersey that I had my first romance. I was only there for 3 weeks, but I fell in love with an American girl. When we were over there, we didn't stay in hotels. We were staying in people's houses, and I have to admit, it was a life-shattering moment in young Steve Wraith when I had to leave my newfound love because I was convinced that me and her would be together forever, and I cried my eyes out on departure from the sleepy town of Herkimer. When I got back to Newcastle, me and the love of my life were pen pals for a while, but it quickly fizzled out. It wasn't only the United States of America that I got to travel to with the theatre school, because when I was 16, I got the chance to go to Russia, which was also an amazing experience. Shortly before I left school, I had to go for my options. That day I went and had a chat with Mr. Johnson, the headmaster, and when he asked what I was going to do for my future, I told him I was going to become a famous actor. Mr. Johnson laughed in my face. Mr. Johnson ranted at me that there was no chance whatsoever of me becoming famous, and that I should live in the real world. With that comment, I just shrugged my shoulders and told him that that's what my future held for me. Mr. Johnson was your typical headmaster who'd cane people for fun. Every single child in the school was frightened of him when he entered the room, as he had a real presence about him. He'd always be seen with a cup of coffee, and he carried polos to take the edge off his breath. He also taught maths, which I hated. His favourite line when he pointed up to the blackboard was chung chung. None of us knew what that meant. In his class, I totally switched off. I had no interest, and I used to sit there copying everything from Thomas Cullen, who was the swot of the class and would produce A's for fun year in, year out. Every single week I'd ask Thomas for his homework and I'd copy it to the letter before we handed it in. I'll never forget the day that Thomas and I fell out, and his idea of payback towards me was when he gave me his homework on 10 questions. He would do 8 right and 2 wrong. Thomas knew that the headmaster had his suspicions and thought I was cheating my way through school, but he couldn't work it out until now, and Thomas provided with him the evidence that he needed. When Mr. Johnson marked my homework, he saw what I'd handed in was exactly the same as the lad I was close to, so this was concrete evidence in his eyes. Like a police officer who'd been hunting bank robbers, this was his jackpot moment. Wraith, yours and Thomas Cullen's work are both wrong, and they're identically wrong in the very same way, Mr. Johnson told me. Wraith, can you come up to the front of the class, please? I got up and did the death march to the front with everyone's eyes burning into me. Glaring at me with his shirt half out, Mr. Johnson ranted, Wraith, can you enlighten us all as how you got this wrong? I just looked puzzled and I told him no. I said, if I've got it wrong, then how can I tell you how I've got it wrong? That's your job. As I've said that, he's immediately jumped out of his chair, got me by the neck and slammed me on top of the desk. At the time I was 14, but I was pinned against the desk, gasping, "Sir, sir." I couldn't breathe. He then screamed at me, "You Wraith, you think you're clever, boy, but you're going to amount to nothing in life." Then he screamed, "You didn't do that homework because you copied it from Thomas Cullen, didn't you?" As soon as he shouted that, my friend Thomas Cullen said, "That's correct, sir, he did," like the proper swot he was, and totally blew me in. By this point, Mr. Johnson still had hold of me round the neck, but somehow I managed to say, "Sir, sir," and when he said, "What?" I said, "Your breath stinks." As soon as I muttered that, there was an uproar as the whole class erupted in laughter, and I was then dragged out by my ear to stand outside for the full lesson. The only other time something like that happened to me was during religious education. At the time, the only religion I was interested in wore black and white stripes at St James's Park. I just found the whole thing boring. So when I was told that I had to write an essay on Jesus, God and Mary, I decided to beef it up a little bit. So I wrote a 2-page western. I've actually still got it in the house. I called the characters the Old Man God and Jesus the Kid, where the pair of them worked in a saloon. Don't ask me why I did it, but at that time I thought it was a masterpiece. Needless to say, what followed was 0 out of 10 and "see me after school. This is blasphemy." That led to me getting a major detention, and I got a few crossed words at home. Looking back at that time, my mind was made up. I was going to be a famous actor, and that was that. Maybe my only proper success story during my school years was down to a couple of has-beens. East End villains named Ronnie and Reggie Cray. I remember it as if it was yesterday, seeing the Crays on television in 1982 stepping out of a green prison van at their mother Violet's funeral. I was a 10-year-old boy, but something subliminal stuck in my head about those two. Now, fast forward my life to when I was 15 years of age in 1987, and I was walking along Newcastle's Quayside Market. Now, what was about to happen, I believe, was fate, and it would shape my future forever. Although I don't know it at the time, I was walking through the indoor market, and an old orange copy of John Pearson's 1972 book, The Profession of Violence, jumped out at me. I always had some money on me to spend, so I walked over and picked up this tatty-looking book, which was 30p, and straight away I had a look at the pictures. The first picture I saw was the twins in their sweaters as kids. The next picture I saw was 2 blokes getting out the back of green vans. That's when the penny dropped, and I could recall my first sighting from 5 years earlier. I took the book home, I read it twice in the same week, and I was completely fascinated by it. The biggest attraction for me was their lifestyle. I loved the fact that they were sharp dressers and Reggie had a good-looking woman on his arm. I loved the fact that they were mixing with celebrities and they were boxers. They owned nightclubs and bars, and at that point I was 15, so I was curious about these nightclubs and bars, and the whole story bowled me over. I say has-beens, and I've gone on to make a lot of money out of the Cray twins over the years. But looking back, the Crays were has-beens at that point. They were in prison and had been in prison for many years. They were never going to get out. I would say the writer John Pearson romanticised it to a degree so that the murders that they committed of George Cornell, Jack the Hat McVitie, and Frank the Mad Axe Mitchell were irrelevant as well as all their other misdemeanours. I was only looking at all the positive stuff and the glamorised side to the Crays, if you like. As my fascination with the twins grew, my mum encouraged it, but my dad was the complete opposite. My dad is a lovely man, and I'm lucky to have him in my life, and I love him. He had a very hard upbringing with his strict parents, and he was only an only child who would get punished quite severely by my granddad for the slightest thing. This made my dad a disciplinarian, and he wouldn't think twice about hitting me if I did anything wrong. I certainly didn't come from an abusive home, but if I needed a belt now and again, I would get it, and rightly so. As I grew older, I did start to resent my dad for belting me, and when I was 21, we had a row, and Dad and I had an infamous roll around on the living room floor. We can laugh about it now, but I was an idiot that night, fueled by the demon drink. My dad learned from that whole experience too. He never raised his hands to me brother because he felt guilty about what he'd done to me. Going back to those terrible twins, Peter Yates said to me that if I wanted to, I could study the profession of violence, but it was part of my GCSE exams. The reason behind that, I was currently studying no other books under my previous English teacher, so this was his attempt in lightening my interest in something. I still had to follow the curriculum books such as Brave New World by Aldous Huxley, The Crucible by Arthur Miller, and Twelfth Night by William Shakespeare. I was also allowed to do 2 other books of my own choice for the GCSE English. I chose Day of the Trivets by John Wyndham and The Profession of Violence. I sat all my exams at the cricket club in Sunderland, but spent most of those days looking out of the window watching the groundsman cut the grass. My mind was focused during my English language and English literature and geography exams though. I think I may have written my name on top of the paper on the maths exam and that's it, because to me it was pointless. Do I regret it? Nah, of course not. I still managed to achieve my life goals without those bits of paper. Would I advise youngsters or my kids not to do the same? Of course I would. Don't follow in my footsteps, kids. Stick in, do the best you can. I left school with a B and a C in language and literature, respectively, and a C in geography. I could have done better. The day I left, I took my blazer off and I set fire to it in the back streets of Sunderland. I still meet Mr. Yates along with Mr. Thompson and Mr. Davies, my science teacher, every year for lunch, because it's only down to him that I got any qualifications. And I'll always be eternally grateful to him. In fact, I dedicated my very first book to him, The Craze the Geordie Connection, which was released in 2002, because he's a man who did so much for me when all the other teachers viewed me as a waste of time.